we are taught to see George Washington as an untouchable figure, the flawless hero, the father of the nation. His face carved into stone, printed on the dollar bill, and painted in portraits that show him as calm, wise, and almost saintly. His life story, as told by school books and patriotic myths, is one of sacrifice, patriotism, and virtue. He is remembered as the man who united the colonies, defeated the mighty British Empire, and then, most famously, stepped away from power voluntarily, proving that the young republic was greater than the ambitions of any one man. But the deeper we look, the more cracks appear in that carefully polished image. For more than 2 centuries, American historians have repeated the same tale. And for more than 2 centuries, the same questions have been ignored. The first problem lies in his papers. Washington was a prolific writer. He sent and received thousands of letters, notes, and instructions. And yet, a strange fact emerges when we study the last years of his life. Entire sections of his correspondence are missing. Historians estimate that out of nearly 500 letters from his final years, fewer than half survive. Where did the others go? Why are there blank spaces in the archives precisely in the years when Washington was corresponding with European financiers and private secret societies? Even his death is surrounded by contradictions. Official history tells us he died in December of 1799, suffering from a sudden throat infection. But when we compare the testimony of his doctors, nothing matches. One physician claimed it was a simple cold. Another wrote of blood poisoning. Still another mentioned an infection unlike any he had seen before. Some records even suggest that Washington, only days before his illness, confessed privately that he no longer trusted the people around him. What exactly happened in his final hours? And why do the medical records sound more like a cover-up than a diagnosis? There is also the matter of his secret affiliations. Washington's membership in the Masons is well known. That much is not controversial. But documents from lodges of the era suggest he was far more than just an honorary member. He presided over meetings where military and political strategies were debated, sometimes in parallel with Congress itself. Certain resolutions of the Masonic lodges appear eerily similar to decisions made later by the Continental Congress. Coincidence? Or evidence that an invisible structure, older than the United States itself, was guiding the birth of the nation? Letters from his contemporaries deepen the mystery. General Nathaniel Greene once wrote, "The commander does not stand only upon the army. There are those he hears more than us." Who were these unnamed advisors, trusted more than his generals? And why do none of their names appear in the official histories? Some early biographies hint at forces moving in the shadows. They speak of Washington receiving visits late at night, from men whose names were never recorded, and of meetings that left no written minutes. Other reports mention European envoys, who came not only with military aid, but with instructions, suggesting that the revolution itself may have been shaped not solely by patriotism, but by the designs of secret alliances. The contradictions multiply when we examine his final years. Washington retired to Mount Vernon, or so the story goes, to live quietly as a farmer. Yet neighbors reported seeing strange visitors arriving at night. The household staff recorded moments when the former president secluded himself with locked chests of papers that vanished after his death. When he finally died, his family pushed for an immediate burial. But conflicting accounts say his body may have been kept under guard, examined repeatedly, even moved before the final interment. Why the urgency? And why did his closest allies insist on silence? What if the untold story of George Washington is not about his victories, but about who controlled him? What if the missing letters, the secret societies, and the contradictions surrounding his death are not isolated curiosities, but pieces of one long pattern, one that suggests the first president of the United States was not entirely his own master? This investigation does not deny his heroism. Washington fought, sacrificed, and inspired. But perhaps the question is not whether he was a hero. The question is, a hero for whom? Was Washington, like every leader after him, part of a circle, guided, pressured, and eventually removed when he became too dangerous? Was his sudden death the result of illness or of a choice made by others? These are the questions that lead us into the shadows of America's founding. Beyond the marble statues, beyond the patriotic legends, lies another Washington, a man surrounded by secrets, conspiracies, and unfinished business. And if his life was edited, manipulated, or silenced 2 centuries ago, then perhaps the story of the United States itself is not quite what we think it is. The American Army of the Revolutionary War is often described in simple terms: poorly equipped, underfunded, and dangerously disorganized. School books tell us about ragged soldiers with no shoes, about hunger in the winter camps, and about a desperate fight against one of the most powerful empires on earth. But what they never mention is that George Washington possessed a resource far more valuable than weapons or supplies. It was a hidden network of influence, a brotherhood whose connections could change the course of history. By the winter of 1776, the Continental Army was collapsing. Soldiers deserted by the hundreds. Supplies were gone. The Continental Congress had no funds left to support the war. Washington's command seemed on the verge of disaster. And then, unexpectedly, a circle of support appeared, one that was not elected by the people, nor appointed by politicians. It was his network of Masonic brothers. Washington had joined the Freemasons back in 1752, when he was just 20 years old. At the time, it was little more than a ceremonial step for a young Virginia gentleman. But decades later, those same Masonic connections gave him access to men who controlled resources, ships, money, weapons, and influence. By the time the war was in full force, more than half of Washington's senior officers were Freemasons. This was not a coincidence. It was a structure, invisible to most, binding the leaders of the revolution with oaths that reached beyond the battlefield. The surviving records of the Alexandria Lodge, where Washington himself held the position of master, list names that align perfectly with his closest generals: Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, Charles Lee. Officially, they were his subordinates, but unofficially, they were bound by shared vows, symbols, and secrets that could sometimes outweigh military discipline. Some historians argue that this secret brotherhood was the very reason Washington received the most decisive support of the war. In 1778, when France finally committed its navy to the American cause, letters circulated among French Masonic circles speaking of our brothers in America who needed assistance. Was it truly chance that French aid arrived precisely when the revolution was nearly lost, or was it the hidden hand of the Brotherhood at work? There are stranger clues still. In 1777, one of Washington's aides, Joseph Reed, wrote in his diary, "Decisions are not always born in the headquarters." He noted that the commander-in-chief sometimes disappeared at night for meetings in private houses, and upon returning, he would alter his strategies. Reed did not name the gatherings, but the implication is clear. They were meetings of the Masons. At the time, the word Mason carried no stigma. It meant a fraternity of educated, influential men who believed themselves guardians of hidden knowledge. But the deeper question is unavoidable. How much of Washington's leadership truly came from his own judgment, and how much was guided, or pressured, by the secret fraternity he had sworn allegiance to decades earlier? In 1780, Washington faced the greatest crisis of loyalty within his ranks. Officers, unpaid and neglected by Congress, began openly speaking of resignation. Morale collapsed. Mutiny seemed inevitable. And yet Washington managed to hold them together with a single, carefully chosen phrase. True brothers are never forgotten. To the common soldier, half literate and desperate for bread, the words sounded empty. But to his officers, many of them Freemasons, the phrase was unmistakable. It was a coded reference, a Masonic assurance that their loyalty would be rewarded, if not by Congress, then by the Brotherhood itself. Letters from General Henry Knox confirmed this. Washington's language was not accidental. It was a calculated invocation of the Masonic bond. That single appeal kept the officer corps loyal at a moment when the army might have dissolved. And so, while muskets and bayonets fought the battles, it was the hidden network of Masonic ties that kept the revolution alive. But the same brotherhood that sustained Washington also created dangerous whispers. If the fate of the new republic was decided not in Congress or on the battlefield, but in the sealed chambers of secret lodges, then who truly governed the revolution? Was Washington leading, or was he being led? And within his own army, fractures began to appear. Because not all Masons were loyal to Washington. Some of them, bound by the same rituals and oaths, owed their allegiance elsewhere. Their loyalties, divided between brotherhood and commander, planted the seeds of conspiracy. It was from these divisions that the first serious plot against Washington emerged, a plan that history now remembers as the Conway Cabal. The history of the United States could have taken a very different path. In 1777, the Continental Army came dangerously close to losing its leader, and it was not the work of the British. It was a conspiracy from within. After the crushing defeat at Brandywine and the fall of Philadelphia into enemy hands, George Washington's reputation was shaken. In Congress, many began to whisper that he was overrated, too cautious, perhaps even unfit to carry the war to victory. But the greater danger came from within his own circle. Some of his generals had begun to doubt whether he could finish what he had started. At the center of this conspiracy was General Thomas Conway. Born in Ireland, trained in Europe, he arrived in America as a seasoned soldier and was quickly elevated to high rank. Conway did not hesitate to speak his mind. He called Washington incompetent, slow, a man unworthy of command. Yet his complaints were only the surface. In private letters to members of Congress, Conway suggested that the Army needed a new leader, General Horatio Gates, the celebrated victor of Saratoga. These suggestions found fertile ground. Gates was being hailed across the colonies as the savior of the Revolution. His victory in New York had restored morale, and many believed he was the man to finish the fight. Had Conway's scheme succeeded, Washington might have been removed, disgraced, and erased from the pages of American history. But what made the plot more dangerous was not just its aim, it was who stood behind it. Conway's letters included names of officers who were not strangers to Washington. They were men who had sworn the same oaths he had, members of the very same Masonic lodges. The brotherhood that was supposed to unite them had fractured. Some remained loyal to Washington. Others saw him as an obstacle to their vision of the new republic. Historians call it the Conway Cabal. Yet in certain surviving documents, it carried another name, the New Order. Beneath this phrase lay an idea both radical and familiar, that America did not need a cautious commander, but a harsher leader, a man willing to act decisively, even ruthlessly. The irony is unmistakable. The same arguments would echo again, centuries later, in critiques of presidents during the 20th century. Washington discovered the conspiracy by chance. A letter from Conway, mocking the weakness of the commander-in-chief, fell into the hands of General James Wilkinson. Wilkinson passed it to Gates, and Gates, perhaps reluctantly, delivered it to Washington. In that moment, the secret was exposed. The standard version of the story ends there. Washington held on to his command. Conway resigned. The conspiracy dissolved into nothing. But the truth is more complicated, and the details do not fit so neatly. Reports preserved in the Philadelphia archives describe clandestine gatherings in 1797 and 1798, where plans for new leadership of the army were openly discussed. Participants included not only officers, but also politicians and even foreign agents. Another clue lies in Conway's life after his resignation. He did not simply vanish. For 2 years, he maintained close ties with European financiers, men who, as later evidence showed, had quietly funded portions of the colonial supply chain. And then there is the most haunting detail of all. In 1778, Conway fought a duel and was gravely wounded. Everyone expected him to die, yet he survived. In a letter written soon after, he confessed, "I thank Providence for sparing my life. But America will one day regret the blind trust it has placed in Washington." The conspiracy did not destroy George Washington, but it scarred him. It left a permanent crack in his confidence and in his view of the men around him. He realized that the enemy was not always across the battlefield. Sometimes it sat at the same table, wore the same symbols, and spoke the same oaths. The Conway cabal was not the end. It was only the beginning, a prelude to something larger, the rise of a secret order that Washington himself had once nurtured, but which, in time, would turn against him. Many imagined that after defeating Britain, George Washington became a completely free leader, finally unshackled and untouchable. But the truth is that in that very moment, a new chain closed around him, a network from which he could never truly escape. In 1783, when the Revolutionary War ended, Washington faced a new problem. Thousands of officers who had fought at his side for years were left without money, without land, and without recognition. Anger and frustration spread through the ranks. Mutiny was on the horizon. To preserve discipline and reward loyalty, Washington gave his blessing to the creation of a new brotherhood, the Society of the Cincinnati. At first glance, it appeared to be a noble idea. The society united veterans of the Revolution, offered aid to their families, and provided a space to honor shared sacrifice. Its name carried a symbolic weight. It was drawn from the Roman general Cincinnatus, who had laid down power after victory and returned to his farm. The society's public purpose was to remind Americans of humility, service, and civic virtue. But very soon, the Society of the Cincinnati became something else. Members swore oaths of loyalty not just to the nation, but to each other. They promised to protect their brothers under all circumstances. And most significant of all, membership was hereditary. It passed from father to son. This was no longer just an association of veterans. It was the seed of a new aristocracy, rooted not in monarchy, but in military glory. The Marquis de Lafayette, himself a celebrated hero of the war and one of the Society's founding members, wrote with unease, "We have created a society which could become a new state within the state." His words would prove prophetic. Almost immediately, accusations began to surface. Newspapers declared that the society was turning into an elitist club, closed to ordinary citizens. In Congress, voices warned that America, having just broken free from monarchy, now risked creating its own military nobility. Washington found himself at the center of the storm. He was the honorary president of the society, yet he knew the danger. In one of his letters, he confessed, "Our brotherhood must beware the temptation of power." But was this warning enough? By the late 1780s, members of the Cincinnati had begun to extend their influence beyond remembrance and loyalty. They were shaping local councils, steering elections, and securing government contracts. There is another detail, rarely mentioned in schoolbooks. One of the society's key symbols was a medallion engraved with the figure of an eagle. Officially, It was nothing more than an emblem of valor and freedom. But modern researchers have noted striking similarities between the design of this medallion and symbols used by secret European orders of the 18th century. In particular, it closely resembled images adopted by French Masonic lodges. Coincidence? Or evidence that the Society of the Cincinnati was conceived from the beginning as part of a wider transatlantic network? Critics saw a direct threat. While common soldiers returned to their farms, forgotten and impoverished, the officers forged a state within a state, bound by private oaths and dynastic ambition. Washington, desperate to preserve balance, remained the society's official figurehead. But in reality, he increasingly withdrew from its internal affairs. Yet the connection endured. His name gave the order legitimacy. His silence gave it freedom to operate. Within a few years, this society would find itself at the heart of political crises and exert a subtle but undeniable influence over America's earliest presidents. But before that could unfold, in the closing years of the 1780s, the young republic faced a new danger: the shadow of European banking houses. Through hidden agents, these powers sought to manipulate the fragile nation, turning debt and dependence into instruments of control. America prided itself on breaking free from the crown of Britain. But few stopped to ask a deeper question. Can you ever truly be independent if your finances are controlled by foreigners? By 1789, when George Washington became the first president of the United States, the young republic seemed victorious. The colonies had won their freedom. The war was over. A new constitution had been ratified. To the public, it looked like a triumph without shadows. But behind that facade of liberty stood a darker truth. The United States was nearly bankrupt. The Revolutionary War had left behind crushing debts, millions of dollars that the government did not have. Those funds had not come from thin air. They had been borrowed from French financiers who had supplied weapons and fleets, borrowed from Dutch trading houses who extended credit across the Atlantic, and even, in a bitter irony, borrowed from British investors who continued to profit from the conflict even as their own empire was defeated. Washington understood the gravity of this crisis. Without a solution to the debt, the fragile Union of States would collapse before it had even begun. And it was here, in the world of finance, that figures emerged whose names are rarely spoken in school books. The Morris family of Philadelphia, the Baring House of London, the great banking syndicates of Amsterdam. These were not generals, not politicians, but they had the power to shape the future of the new nation. At the center of this financial web stood one man: Alexander Hamilton. Brilliant, ambitious, and relentless, Hamilton would soon become the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury. Unlike Jefferson or Madison, who dreamed of a republic of farmers, Hamilton believed survival demanded something else: a strong financial system built on the confidence of European creditors. His plan was radical. The federal government would assume all state debts, consolidate them, and issue new bonds, creating one unified national debt. On the surface, this seemed like salvation. It restored order, reassured creditors, and stabilized the economy. But there was a price. Those bonds were quickly purchased by foreign investors. In exchange for security, America had given outsiders a silent lever of control. Washington, ever the pragmatist, supported Hamilton's plan. He knew it was the only way to prevent collapse, but he also knew what it meant. In one letter, he admitted with striking honesty, "We have freed ourselves from a king, but we must now prove we can free ourselves from debt." The newspapers of the time exploded with argument. Critics charged that Hamilton and Washington had sold the country to Europe. Supporters insisted that without foreign credit, the republic would not survive even a year. Yet there was also a third view, a far more dangerous suspicion. Among congressional archives are fragments that hint at secret guarantees given to European financiers. These were not merely promises of repayment, they carried political weight. One clause, whispered about but never published, allegedly granted foreign investors rights to participate in the allocation of Western lands. Territories that had not yet been settled by Americans were already being treated as bargaining chips by bankers overseas. Who exactly stood behind these shadowy agreements? The names that appear are eerily familiar. Families who, a century later, would dominate global finance. Their fingerprints, though faint, suggest they were present from the very birth of the United States. Direct proof may be missing, but the circumstantial evidence is unsettling. Washington found himself trapped in a dilemma with no good answers. He did not want his new republic to become a puppet of Europe, yet he had no other choice. Either acknowledge the dependence or leave the country penniless, unable to defend itself. This web of financial obligations did not end with his presidency. It lingered in every administration, shaping every crisis. And it provided the backdrop for what came next. Because in 1790, less than a year into Washington's first term, rebellion broke out in the Western territories. It was the first warning sign, proof that debts and deals struck in secret could soon spill into open unrest. And for the first time, America was forced to ask, had it really won independence or merely exchanged one form of control for another? America had just been born, and yet it already stood on the edge of fracture. For the first time, the enemy did not come from outside. It rose from within the country itself. In 1791, the young federal government imposed a new tax on the production of whiskey. For the merchants and established cities of the East, it was little more than an inconvenience. But for the farmers living on the edges of civilization, in the mountains of Pennsylvania and along the rugged western frontier, the tax was nothing short of a death sentence. Whiskey was not just a drink, it was currency. It was the medium of trade, the coin of debt, the lifeline of frontier survival. To tax it was to strip these people of their economy. And so, in the eyes of many, the new tax was not just a law, it was an insult. A deliberate attempt by Washington and the Congress to break those who already lived on the hardest margins of the Republic. The protests began as scattered resistance, but soon they evolved into something much darker. Armed crowds surrounded the homes of tax collectors. Federal agents were beaten, threatened, and driven from towns. Barns and houses were set on fire. In the cities of the East, newspapers called it a rebellion. But for the frontier settlers themselves, it was something else entirely. They called it the Second Revolution. And this time, their enemy was not the British crown, but their own federal government. George Washington now faced the most delicate crisis of his presidency. If he yielded, the authority of the federal government would vanish. But if he crushed the rebellion with force, he risked alienating thousands of ordinary citizens, the very people whose trust the new nation desperately needed. And yet, what disturbed Washington the most was not simply the anger of the farmers. It was the whispers of where their support came from. In the correspondence of state governors, there are hints that the rebels carried weapons not forged in America, muskets of French design, pistols of unmistakably British origin. How did such arms find their way into the hills of Pennsylvania? Official history claims it was contraband, or captured war surplus from years past. But a report that reached Washington's desk in 1792 carried a far more ominous message. His intelligence officers warned, there are signs that foreign agents seek to inflame this insurrection. The question was never answered. Was it France, fresh from its own bloody revolution, hoping to turn the United States into a mirror of Paris? Or was it Britain, the old empire, quietly working to break its lost colonies from within? The truth remains unclear. But the timing, the weapons, the patterns of discipline among the rebels, all suggested hands far more experienced than simple farmers. Washington made his choice, and it was unlike anything America had seen before. He personally mounted his horse, gathered an army of nearly 13,000 troops, and led them westward himself. It was the first, and remains the only, time in American history that a sitting president commanded troops in the field. For those who witnessed it, the sight was unforgettable. The father of the nation, riding at the head of a column of soldiers, moving not against a foreign foe, but against his own citizens. The rebellion collapsed almost at once. Its leaders fled. The crowds melted away. The farmers, many of them bewildered by the sudden show of force, returned to their fields. On the surface, order was restored. But beneath that calm, Washington was shaken. In private letters, he confessed his unease at what he had seen. Certain groups among the rebels, he wrote, moved with a strange discipline, almost as though they had been drilled by professional soldiers. The Whiskey Rebellion had been suppressed. The Republic had survived. But Washington had learned a lesson he would never forget. America was still fragile. Its people could be turned against one another, and foreign powers, lurking just across the ocean, could exploit that fragility as a weapon. The young republic returned to a fragile peace. Yet the warning had been delivered, and in only a few years, Washington would face a far greater trial. This time, it would not be farmers in the hills. It would come from the very heart of American politics itself. George Washington often said, "The true enemy of America is not the cannons of Britain, nor the debts owed to Europe. The true danger is division within our own walls." When the Constitution of the United States was ratified, its authors dreamed of unity. They believed a new republic could rise above the factionalism of old monarchies. Leaders chosen by the people would serve the common good, not private ambition. But the dream did not last long. Almost immediately, fault lines appeared. And within just a few years, Washington would face a crisis he had feared more than any battlefield: the emergence of political factions inside his own government. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. They envisioned a strong central government, closely tied to Europe's financial networks, with a robust military and industrial future. On the other side stood Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans, champions of the independent farmer, advocates of limited federal power, and allies of revolutionary France. For Washington, it was the worst possible scenario. Men who had once fought shoulder to shoulder for independence were now turning into bitter enemies. Cabinet meetings became battlegrounds. Ministers accused one another of corruption, conspiracy, even treason. The conflict spilled into the public sphere. Newspapers aligned with Hamilton or Jefferson began publishing vicious attacks. Each side accused the other of betraying the revolution. By the mid-1790s, America was no longer one nation with a single cause. It was becoming two camps. In Philadelphia, Federalists gathered in exclusive clubs to plot strategy. In Virginia, Jeffersonian speakers rallied farmers with fiery denunciations of centralized authority. What had once been unity in the fight for liberty was fracturing into political warfare. Washington saw it with dread. He knew that if the factions hardened into permanent parties, the republic might collapse before it had even found its footing. In his famous farewell address, he would warn with chilling clarity, "The spirit of party is a poison for the republic. It opens the door to foreign influence, and it undermines the people's trust in their government." The warning was not abstract. Already, foreign agents lurked in the shadows. French emissaries sought to bind America to Paris and its revolutionary ideals. British diplomats maneuvered to pull the young nation back into London's orbit. And behind the curtain of both sides were the bankers, families in Amsterdam, London, and Paris, who had financed the revolution. and now saw opportunity in America's disunity. Historians rarely discuss one revealing detail. In Washington's private letters, he confided that he feared a strong hand from abroad might seize the moment of division to impose its will on the United States. He sensed, perhaps more keenly than anyone, how fragile independence truly was. Officially, there were no conspiracies, no secret plots recorded in the ledgers of Congress. But the coincidences piled up. Outbreaks of unrest, timed with European interventions, anonymous pamphlets that mirrored foreign propaganda, financial backers of newspapers with ties across the Atlantic. Even Washington's contemporaries whispered that the Republic stood on a precipice. Washington himself tried to remain above the fray. He wanted to be the neutral figure, the guardian of unity, the man who could arbitrate between rivals. But the more he tried to rise above partisanship, the more each side accused him of betrayal. To Hamilton's allies, he seemed too indulgent of Jefferson. To Jefferson's camp, he appeared compromised by Federalist power. It was a cruel paradox. The one man the nation trusted to hold it together was also the man both factions resented for refusing to choose. By the end of his first term, Washington was weary. He had survived military campaigns, conspiracies, rebellions, but nothing tested his patience like the venom of political rivalry. And yet, the country demanded more. The Republic was too fragile, the storms too fierce, for him to step aside. The struggle of parties was only beginning, and ahead of Washington lay the hardest decision of his life, whether to endure a second term as president or to walk away and risk leaving a divided nation to tear itself apart. George Washington dreamed of leaving it all behind. He longed to return to Mount Vernon, to walk among his fields, and to live in the peace he had fought so hard to secure. He wanted, at last, to become a private man again. But America would not let him go. In 1792, Washington was re-elected almost unanimously. On the surface, he was the most popular man in the nation. In reality, he was exhausted, worn down by years of politics, endless intrigue, and crushing pressure. Again and again he told friends that he wanted to retire, but his colleagues pressed him to stay. They warned that if he stepped aside, the young republic would collapse, torn apart by the rival factions of Hamilton and Jefferson. And so, reluctantly, Washington accepted. The second term began not with triumph, but with storms on every horizon. To the east was France. The revolution in Paris was reaching its fever pitch, and Jeffersonian Republicans demanded that America honor its revolutionary ideals and stand with its sister republic. To the west was Britain. Its navy still dominated the Atlantic, and American merchants complained daily of seized ships and broken treaties. Washington was caught between two blades of the same shears. If he chose France, Britain could retaliate with war, a war America could not afford. If he favored Britain, the people, still drunk on the rhetoric of liberty, would see him as a traitor to the cause of freedom. The breaking point came in 1794 with the signing of what became known as Jay's Treaty. Britain agreed to withdraw its troops from frontier forts and, in exchange, retained significant trading privileges. To Hamilton and the Federalists, it was a brilliant diplomatic achievement. To Jefferson and his followers, it was betrayal, proof that Washington was selling out the revolution. In Philadelphia, angry crowds burned effigies of the president. Newspapers printed savage caricatures of him as a new monarch, cloaked not in Republican virtue, but in British gold. And beneath the public rage, something darker was stirring. Jay's treaty had not only geopolitical consequences, but financial ones. British banks and trading houses gained new channels of influence. American merchants tied to the Federalist elite grew rich. For the first time, Washington saw clearly that even his own allies were beginning to act not for the nation, but for themselves. Even Alexander Hamilton, once the president's most trusted confidant, was implicated in financial scandals. To Washington, this was the deepest wound of all. In private letters, he confessed his despair. The greatest danger to this republic does not come from armies abroad, but from the betrayal of those who call themselves its friends. Meanwhile, whispers of conspiracy grew louder. Reports circulated of secret meetings between party leaders and foreign envoys. French agents spread pamphlets urging rebellion against the government. British consuls quietly funneled money into the pockets of pliant officials. America was becoming less a sovereign republic than a chessboard for foreign powers. Washington knew then that his second term was not a reward, but a trap. He was no longer simply governing a nation. He was fighting shadows within his own house. It was during these years that he began to speak often of a principle that would echo for generations: that America must avoid entangling alliances and stand apart from the ceaseless rivalries of Europe. Later, historians would see this as the foundation of U.S. foreign policy. But in the moment, it was a confession. A weary man admitting he trusted no one, neither supposed allies nor sworn enemies. Yet even as he battled political division, financial corruption, and the invisible hands of foreign powers, an even greater threat was forming. Behind the newspapers, beyond the shouting crowds, and beneath the debates in Congress, something darker was taking shape. A web of espionage, infiltration, and secret correspondence was spreading across the Republic. It would be remembered as the first true intelligence crisis in American history, and it would fall squarely on the shoulders of George Washington. America in the 1790s had no intelligence service of its own, no professional spies, no secret agency. But it was already a battlefield of espionage, and the most dangerous enemy was not hiding on the frontier. It was moving quietly through the very heart of government. At the time, the capital of the United States was Philadelphia. Outwardly, the city was a place of debate and democratic passion. The streets buzzed with arguments about France and Britain. Newspapers printed endless pamphlets attacking George Washington. Political clubs formed and divided, each swearing loyalty to its own vision of the Republic. But behind the noise of free speech, another struggle was unfolding: a hidden war of foreign spies. French agents worked beneath the mask of diplomacy. They hosted glittering receptions where young politicians, journalists, and even army officers were courted, intoxicated with promises of support, and slowly drawn into France's orbit. Britain responded with its own weapons, bribing officials, intercepting communications, and manipulating trade routes. Step by step, Philadelphia was transformed into a chessboard where almost every piece seemed to be moving for London or Paris, but rarely for America itself. Washington began receiving reports that disturbed him deeply. One warned of a so-called Society of Democratic Clubs. Officially, it was a forum for political discussion. In truth, it had become a gathering place for radicals inspired by the French Revolution. Pamphlets passed hand to hand within its walls, calling for the overthrow of what they described as the tyranny of federal power. Yet even more alarming were the rumors that reached the president's desk about his own Senate. There were whispers that certain senators were holding private meetings with British emissaries. Historians still debate how much of this was true. But the atmosphere of suspicion in Philadelphia became suffocating, and Washington himself became the prime target. In anonymous newspaper articles, he was denounced as a monarch in disguise, accused of secret deals with Britain, and even of plotting to hand the presidency to his heirs. These were not simply random insults. They were coordinated campaigns, the first organized disinformation attacks against a sitting American president. No official proof of foreign interference was ever presented, yet the coincidences were too sharp to ignore. In reports from the British Embassy in Philadelphia, Historians have discovered exact quotations from private government meetings, details that could only have come from someone inside the American administration. Washington understood what this meant. The enemy was not just across the Atlantic. The enemy was seated at the same table, perhaps even wearing the same badge of office. His response was pragmatic but grim. He curtailed diplomatic outreach. He ordered stricter surveillance of officials. He tried to plug the leaks with discipline and discretion, but the damage was already done. Trust within his government had been poisoned, perhaps beyond repair. For Washington, this was a personal turning point. After decades of service, after surviving the revolution, after enduring the birth of a fragile nation, he began to ask himself whether the Republic could survive at all. Could a country without loyalty at its core withstand the relentless pull of foreign powers? This sense of betrayal became the backdrop to his final act as president. It was this atmosphere, suspicion, corruption, espionage, and endless foreign influence, that convinced him there was only one path left. Washington would step aside. He would leave the nation in the hands of its people, with a warning carved into history. Beware of factions. Beware of foreign influence. Beware of the enemy within. It was not just a letter. It was a warning that America has been hearing for more than 200 years. Washington was stepping down, but his words became a prophecy of what awaited the young republic. In 1796, George Washington announced that he would not run for a third term as president. For his contemporaries, it was a shock. In Europe, rulers clung to power until death. Many Americans assumed Washington would do the same. But he chose another path. He walked away voluntarily, to prove that the Republic was stronger than any single man. Yet his departure was anything but quiet. Before leaving the presidency, Washington released a document that would be remembered as the farewell address. It was not a speech delivered before Congress, nor a triumphant declaration to the crowds. It was a carefully composed message, written with the help of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, crafted not as ceremony, but as a political testament. In it, Washington summarized his years in power, but more importantly, he left behind warnings that sound strikingly modern. First, he spoke of the mortal danger of political factions. The spirit of party, he wrote, opens the door to revenge, divides the people, and invites the influence of foreign powers. He knew this from experience. He had witnessed the young republic nearly tear itself apart in the battles between Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans. Second, he cautioned against permanent alliances with foreign nations. America, he argued, should trade and maintain friendly relations with all, but avoid binding commitments. Otherwise, the Republic would be dragged into wars that were not its own. This was his direct response to the pressures of France and Britain, each trying to pull the nation to its side. Third, he called for the preservation of national unity. Washington insisted that America was not merely a collection of states, but a single nation with a shared destiny. He urged citizens not to fall into regional feuds, not to place the interests of Virginia or Pennsylvania above the interests of the whole. For the people of the 1790s, this address was a revelation. Newspapers debated it fiercely. Partisans twisted his words to fit their own causes. Yet the text itself quickly took on an almost sacred status. It was reprinted in pamphlets, read aloud in schools, quoted at public ceremonies. To many Americans, it became something like scripture. And yet, there is another side to the story. Some historians argue that the farewell address was not entirely Washington's voice, but rather the work of his circle, especially Alexander Hamilton. If that is true, then even Washington's final testament may have been another myth, another carefully edited version of reality. After leaving office, Washington returned to Mount Vernon, where he spent his final years in relative peace. But his retirement did not end the turmoil. In fact, the nation soon found itself caught in new conflicts and new divisions, precisely the kinds he had predicted. What remains undeniable is this: George Washington became not only the father of his country, but also the man who understood the central truth of the Republic. The greatest threats to America would not always come from foreign armies or distant kings. They would rise from within, from the nation's own divisions, its own ambitions, and its own inability to hold unity. His words about the dangers of faction, the betrayal of alliances, and the ease with which the people could be manipulated through fear and pride. They sound as though they were written yesterday. The guardian of the Republic left the stage, but his warning did not fade. And the question that lingers through the centuries is the same: will America listen